Hello everyone, and welcome to Conversation of Power. In other episode, we are again together, and today we are going to discuss with my guest, and we will try to understand the terms of the Global South. What is the Global South? We are, as an academician or scholars or practitioners, you can hear these terms, I think, every part of media or anywhere, the Global South, but yes, maybe we have some superficial information about the Global South, but I think it's better to understand from my guest, and we will try to understand what is the really Global South is. We are talking about a geography. It's a huge part of the planet Earth. Is 85 of the world population, consisting 80% of the resources, and it is the home of to over 6 billion people with an average life expectancy 68 years, and the current median age of almost 25 against the global average of 30. This is amazing numbers from population to the median age, and the resources and the geography it cover. And my guest is today to explain the Global South or the middle powers that we will discuss is Rachel Rudolph. She's currently serves as an adjunct professor of counterterrorism at Nikos College and an assistant professor of social science and researcher at Beijing Institute of Technology, Zhuhai. She has been spent the time in Asia maybe over the 10 years, and China has been her place of residence since 2018. I think that Rachel will be most accurate person to discuss. She is living in China, and China's Global South relation is quite good. And Rachel, welcome to my show.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And I'm going to start from the strategic agency of middle powers. I think we are seeing a shift when nations like Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, and Brazil are no longer waiting for permission from Washington or Beijing to act. This different kind of structure, I think, we are seeing in international relations or in regional level. In 2026, we see the middle powers forming their own unilateral coalitions to solve regional problems. Do you think that this rise of middle powers marked the definitive end of the post-Cold War international order, or we are witnessing the birth of decentralized world where influence is measured by regional connectivity rather than just military size?
Well, I'd frame it like this. The old map still exists, but it no longer explains the terrain. The lines of influence are being redrawn, not only by armies and alliances, but by ports, payment systems, and energy corridors and coalition politics. We're in a transition period. Power is spreading out, but the rules and institutions haven't caught up. And in that transition, middle powers really aren't behaving differently. They're less willing to wait for Washington or Beijing to define the menu. Instead, they're exercising strategic agency. And the clearest expression of that right now is the rise of minilateral coalitions. When big institutions stall and great power rivalry makes broad agreement harder, these smaller coalitions become a practical way for states to coordinate, whether it's regional security, infrastructure, trade corridors, investment, or diplomatic problem solving. Now, does that mark a definitive end of the post-Cold War era? I think the evidence supports a careful answer. The post-Cold War assumption that one center of gravity can manage the system is clearly weakening. But what's replacing it isn't finished, a stable order. It's a world becoming more networked, more hierarchical.
Rachel, could you hear me now?
Yeah.
Your visual seems to freezing. Yes, now it started. Okay.
Oh, sorry. There may be the network issue. I'm so sorry about that.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. I can hear you.
Okay, sorry. So anyway, at the end of the day, for your question, I think that the world's becoming more network, more hierarchical, where influence depends on the issue area. A country can be powerful in one lane, energy, finance, logistics, diplomacy, even if it's a military heavy, even if it isn't a military heavyweight. And I think that's why when we think about Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, and Brazil, they're useful. They're useful cases because each shows a different pathway. Indonesia, for example, illustrates agency through regional connectivity, maritime geography, trade routes, supply chain positioning. Its leverage comes from where it sits in the region's strategic and economic networks. Saudi Arabia demonstrates a different form of agency, how energy leverage, capital, and convening power translates into geopolitical weight. Brazil shows an influence through diplomacy and agenda setting, regional leadership, and global debates on food systems, etc. They're not identical models, but they share the same impulse, building options, changing terms of engagement, and resisting automatic alignment.
And just moving beyond the extraction of the economy, for decades, the Global South was integrated into the world economy primarily as a supplier of raw materials. But today, from Jakarta to San Diego, we see a wave of resource nationalism where countries are banning raw export force of local processing. So, do you think that this strategy is successfully creating a high value industrialization at home, or are we risking a backlash where advanced economies simply accelerate the development of synthetic alternative to bypass these new restrictions?
Well, I think the framing is the right starting point, but the old integration model was essentially the global south supplies inputs and value gets created elsewhere. So what you're calling resource nationalism is really an attempt to rewrite the contract to keep more processing the jobs and industrial learning at home. Is it working, or does it trigger a backlash? The most evidence-based answer is it can work, but it's conditional, and the backlash isn't hypothetical. The strategy buys producer states leverage, but leverage only becomes industrialization if you can turn it into capacity fast enough that markets don't reorganize around you. Take Indonesia, because it's often treated as a flagship case. What makes Indonesia's strategy more effective wasn't simply announcing restrictions. It was the way policy was tied to clear industrial objective, pulling investments into domestic processing, and it had enough market relevance that firms couldn't easily ignore. The restrictions acted as a lever, but the story is the real follow-through, creating an investment pathway where companies could justify building processing capacity onshore. The lesson is that export controls create negotiating power, but credibility, infrastructure, and scale determine whether the power turns into factories and skills rather than headlines. But you contrast that with Zimbabwe and Namibia, the logic is the same. While you keep exporting raw material and importing value, but the constraints are tighter. Processing is expensive, energy intensive, and technology dependent. If electricity is unreliable, logistics are costly, financing is hard to secure, policy is perceived as volatile. That's where resource nationalism can underperform. You can signal a policy signal, but you don't get an industrial ecosystem. You might see isolated projects, but the broader supply base, skills pipeline, and downstream industries, that actually shifts the structure of economy. And then you have in Latin America, the lithium triangle, Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile. It's a perfect illustration of both the promise and the fragility of the strategy. Lithium is strategically valuable, so the temptation to force more local value add is obvious, but outcomes diverge because success conditions diverge. The investment climate, the clarity and stability of rules, the state's capacity to manage, etc. Lithium also shows the time problem because energy transition is moving quickly. And that takes us to the second part of the question, the backlash. It's more important not to reduce it only to synthetic alternatives, even though substitution is part of it. Advanced economies and firms have responded in several different ways. They've diversified suppliers. They lock in supply from preferred partners through long-term contracts. They expand recycling and circular supply chains. They use standards and trade instruments. And over time, they invest in innovation that lowers the strategic value of any one input. So yes, restrictions can accelerate R&D and substitution and incentives, especially when governments treat the commodity as a national security vulnerability. That's why the real strategic question is, do producers, states use this moment to build durable capability fast enough that they remain central even as technology evolves? So when does resource nationalism succeed? When a country has enough market importance to matter, when power and logistics can support processing, when policy is consistent enough to justify long-term investment, and when the state actively designs spillovers. And when it's unlikely to succeed, well, that's when restrictions come before capacity, when infrastructure and governance can't carry the investment burden, or when buyers quickly diversify away. In those cases, the policy can reduce revenue without producing the industrial base it's meant to create. So the bottom line, resource nationalism can be a pathway to high-value industrialization, but it's not a shortcut. It creates leverage and opens a window. The outcome depends on whether states can convert the window into real industrial capability before global markets and technology can reorganize around them. And that connects directly to another layer of the conversation. Once you start pushing for local value add, you're not just negotiating with companies, you're negotiating with an entire geopolitical system of supply chains, standards, and strategic dependencies.
And especially in times of the great power competition, and from the Western perspective, maybe the narratives almost always insist to the countries that choose between G7 and the Eastern countries. So, however, most global South seems to be pursuing poly alignment, partnering with China for trade, for infrastructure, for security to the United States, and look at the European countries for maybe a trade. So, do you think that is this balancing act sustainable as the global economy fragmented into distinct technological blocks? Or will the cost of maintaining this separate system eventually force these nations to pick a side?
Well, I think we need to adjust the framing a little bit. Because think about it, even the Western story has shifted in a more multipolar direction, especially in Trump-style discourse, which sounds less like a universal rules narrative and more like bargaining, spheres of interest, and deal-making. But here's the tension. Even when the rhetoric admits multipolarity, the system still behaves in ways that create pressure, export controls, sanction risks, competing standards. So there are moments where countries aren't told to pick a side, but they're quietly pushed into binary choices. And that's why the poly alignment has become so common across global South capitals. It isn't just ambiguity for its own sake. It's a form of strategic resilience. The logic is simple. Diversify dependence so no single power can close your options. The real question, though, and it's one that you're asking, is whether the resilience holds as the world hardens into distinct technology and financial blocks. Because that's the sharpest pressure on poly alignment, isn't ideological, but rather structural. It's what people call splinternet, the gradual splitting of the global technology stack into separate ecosystems. And it shows up most clearly in areas that create lock-in, where your choice today shapes your economy for years. 5G, advanced semiconductors, now AI. The typical cases in the literature, Vietnam is one of them. And that's probably the clearest example of poly alignment as like an art form. What sometimes is referred to in literature as like the bamboo approach. Hanoi treats China as a permanent fact of geography and supply chains, but treats the United States as an essential for wider integration. So you get this dual posture. Deepened cooperation with China on the one hand, and at the same time, an upgraded relationship with Washington, including investment tied to green energy and semiconductor supply chains. The deeper strategy, Vietnam wants to stay embedded in a multiple production networks at once, not because that eliminates risk, but because it makes it harder for any one bloc to force one clean break. Indonesia shows a different model. Free and active foreign policy paired with critical mineral strategy. It used nickel export to ban to force domestic processing, much of it financed with Chinese capital. But at the same time, Jakarta pursued Western partnerships, just like the Just Energy Transition Partnership and the Critical Minerals Arrangement, partly to keep access to Western subsidy-linked supply chains. And that's where your pressure point appears. As standards harden in EV and tech supply chains, Indonesia may end up running a parallel streams, one aligned with Western requirements and one aligned with Eastern ecosystems. That poly-alignment turning into a dual system cost. That's then you have South Africa, which is completely different when it comes to poly-alignment, and maybe perhaps the brightest political spotlight. It leans into BRICS as a platform for revisionist multilateralism while still relying heavily on trade with ties with the US and EU. But sustainability gets tested when you layer security signaling, like maritime exercises in Russia with Russia and China, which triggers very intense external reaction. So South Africa shows tension clearly: symbolic alignment, security signaling, and economic necessity, all operating at the same time. Once you move into technology, the pressure becomes almost mechanical. With 5G, you get path dependency. Choosing China vendors can be cheaper and faster and sometimes better performance, but it can lock you into an ecosystem that may become harder to integrate into Western standards. Going the trusted vendor route aligned with the West can preserve security cooperation and reduce political risk, but it can be slower, more expensive, and over time that isn't just procurement, it becomes an architecture of the economy. Then with semiconductors, because the US has turned export controls into strategic instrument, shaping who can access and under what conditions, then Global South firms are sitting inside those supply chains. Poly-alignment becomes a compliance puzzle. Which standards apply, which markets stay open, and what accounts are controlled for technology. And then there's the financial dimension. All of these, what it comes down to is that developing countries still sit lower in the global credit hierarchy. They borrow at a higher cost, and they're tied to a payment and infrastructure governed largely by northern rules. So is balancing act sustainable? I'd say the literature pushes toward a three-part test. The nature of fragmentation. If fragmentation stays selective, concentrated in high-tech spots like chips and AI, then a lot of countries can still keep diversified trade in commodities, food systems, and lower value manufacturing. But if it becomes system-wide, and especially if it hits the financial messaging layer, the balancing space shrinks fast. Second, institutional adaptation. Poly-alignment is more sustainable when middle powers can use forums like G20 and BRICS Plus to build issue-based coalitions, expanding bargaining power and easing constraints. If those reforms move evenly, even partially, the pressure for hard decoupling eases. And lastly, technological interoperability. If open architectures, whether that's open AI, interoperable payment protocols, shared standards, they can prevent the world from splitting into sealed proprietary silos. Then countries can reserve digital sovereignty without being forced into one step. So I don't think it's that the future is dramatic or theatrical side picking. I think it's pragmatic and it's tiered. And the big go ahead.
I just want to jump to the green protectionism threats. There is growing feeling that the green transition is being weaponized towards against the developing nations, especially through the mechanism like the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And in that case, many scholars also argue that this kicks away the ladder of development by penalizing emerging industries. So do you think that view these climate policies as a necessary global good, or are they effectively a new form of trade barrier designed to protect Western industry from rising competitions in global South region?
I think this is, again, one of those areas where both sides have a credible case. The disagreement isn't really about whether climate action matters, it's about design and distribution. Who carries the adjustment costs and who captures the benefits? From the EU side, the logic of something like CBAM is pretty straightforward. Europe is pricing carbon at home and it worries about carbon leakage, meaning emissions don't disappear, they just move. If firms can relocate production to places with looser rules, you get a race to the bottom and the climate goal collapses. So border adjustment is meant to keep the incentive structure consistent. Decarbonize here and don't reward dirtier production elsewhere. But from the global south side, the pushback is also serious because in practice, it feels like green protectionism, not because developing countries are rejecting climate responsibility. The deeper argument is the same standard is being applied to profoundly unequal economies without automatically providing the capital, technology, and institutional support needed to meet it. And you can see that in the tension very clearly when you look at a case like Mozambique. Mozambique is unusually vulnerable because the EU export profile is heavily concentrated in aluminum. So if the product you rely on is covered by CBAM, even a relatively modest cost becomes macro relevant, and aluminum is energy intensive. So Mozambique doesn't have an easy, cheap, fast pathway to decarbonize that sector at scale. South Africa is another case, but for a different reason. The carbon intensity there isn't just a firm level choice, it's embedded in the electricity system. Steel and alloys sit on top of a coal-heavy grid. So when CBAM hits, the compliance burden doesn't feel like a tweak at the margin. It feels like an external policy layered on top of structural constraints that are expensive to change. And then you have India, and other large economies like India, making a principled argument about fairness and sequencing. They all point to the idea that common but differentiated responsibilities. In plain terms, countries didn't contribute equally to the problem, and they don't have equal capacity to absorb costs. India's steel sector comes up here because it illustrates a broader point. Rejecting CBAM's unilateral structure is not the same as rejecting decarbonization. It's a dispute of the rules and pathway. To come back to your core question, global good or trade barrier, CBAM is defensible in principle as a climate integrity tool, but it can operate like a trade barrier in effect. And the difference between those two outcomes comes down to what surrounds it. And are there credible pathways for finance, technology transfer, and transition support? Is there flexibility for different starting points? And do the rules actually help countries climb into green industrialization, or do they just price them out? I don't think this gets settled by slogans. The real test is practical. Does climate trade policy become a bridge into green upgrading for developed economies, or a wall that protects Western industry while shifting the adjustment costs onto countries that are still trying to build their productive base?
Rachel, regarding the sovereign debt and the post-IMF area, the current sovereign debt crisis maybe suggests that the traditional financial architecture is no longer fit for purpose. So with the G20 common framework struggling to deliver speedier resolutions, do you think that we are seeing the global south quietly moving toward alternative liquidity sources and bilateral bailout mechanism that bypass the IMF entirely? And what does this mean for the future of the global financial governance?
There's a shift toward alternatives, but it isn't a clean break. It's more like a crowded landscape. The IMF is still central, but it's no longer the only door countries knock on first. And that's the reason's pretty simple: speed and certainty. When debt workouts take years instead of months, governments go looking for liquidity wherever they can find it. Sometimes to avoid conditions, sometimes just to stay afloat while negotiation drag. So if you look at the G20 common framework, the core complaint isn't that it hasn't consistently delivered timely resolution. A big part of that is coordination. Different creditor groups don't agree on what fair burden sharing looks like. Is it principal haircuts? Is it maturity extensions? Is it interest relief? And then you have the private creditor problem. Even when official creditors line up, getting private bondholders to participate can slow everything down. The timelines tell the story. Ethiopia entered the process in early 2021 and sat in technical default for years before the deal in principle started to take shape in 2025. Zambia only entered in early 2021. It made progress by 2024, but it still shows what a long process does to confidence, investment decisions, and fiscal planning. And even when you get movement, the relief can be modest compared to the scale of the problem. So from a government's perspective, it's rational to seek faster liquidity, either to avoid an IMF program or to buy time when restructuring machines move slowly. One alternative channel is central bank swap lines, especially the ones extended by China's central bank across wide sets of countries. Those can deliver liquidity quickly. They often feel politically easier than IMF program because the conditions are less explicit. And in some moments, the support has been large enough to materially ease balance of payments. A second channel, the Gulf bilateral support, deposits, rollovers, and large financial packages used to stabilize partners. And then there's the institutional layer, the BRICS New Development Bank. That belongs in the conversation as well, not as an IMF replacement, but as a parallel development finance channel that can expand policy space for some borrowers. So the case for yes, the alternative rails are growing because the legacy restructure processing is slow, contested, uncertain. But the other side of the debate matters because bypassing the IMF entirely it's much harder than what it sounds, and sometimes not even desirable. First, a lot of alternative liquidity is short-term and potentially expensive. If it's used to postpone adjustment rather than support it, it can actually worsen the trajectory. Second, bilateral lifelines can have their own strings, sometimes less transparent, more deal-based, and more geopolitical. And third, when you move from emergency cash to an actual restructuring, the IMF still plays a unique role as a coordinator and credible anchor. Even critics will admit the IMF can unlock other financing, and it gives markets and multiple creditor groups a common reference point in a complex workout. So what does it mean for global financial governance? I think we're moving towards a multi-rail system, more pathways for liquidity, more parallel institutions, and more bargaining, and potentially more fragmentation. So the bottom line, yes, we're seeing quite a diversification away from IMF-centered crisis management. It's driven by slow restructuring and political cost conditionality. And you see it in the swap line support, Gulf packages in cases like Egypt, Pakistan, and the BRICS New Development Bank. But it's not a clean post-IMF era. The most likely future then, hybrid governance, more rails, more bargaining, and an ongoing fight over the rules, speed, transparency, and burden sharing.
And I think digital sovereignty and AI divide is another place for battle between these two alternative order. And as the artificial intelligence reshape productivity, there is a risk of a technological apartheid, maybe, where the global south becomes a passive consumer of AI models trained in Silicon Valley. So how can developing nations build digital sovereignty to ensure they own their own data and digital infrastructure rather than becoming digital colonies of the major tech superpowers?
Yeah, techno-apartheid is a loaded phrase, but it's pointing to something real. The risk is structural. The most powerful AI models, the cloud, compute, and platforms behind them are being built in a very small corporate and geographic corridor. And then a lot of the global south ends up downstream, mostly consuming tools that don't reflect local languages, norms, or economic realities, while capturing only a thin slice of the value. But I want to be fair to the other side. AI can bring real gains, productivity, service delivery, innovation. So the question is an AI or no AI? The real question is, how do we adopt AI without reproducing dependency, without becoming a digital colony. One way to see the dependency risk is to notice how digital economy can repeat older extraction patterns. In the old model, countries shipped out raw materials. In the new model, they ended up exporting raw data and even what some people call behavioral surplus, while the high value layer stays external. The model training, the cloud compute, the monetization. And because so much of this gets packaged as neutral, AI for good, the politics can disappear into the code. You see the governance stakes pretty clearly if you look at something like Johannesburg. Smart CCTV networks, AI analytics, facial recognition, often deployed through private security actors. And we know facial recognition has documented bias problems. So the worry from local critics is if these tools are imported and run without local oversight, you can normalize a new version of the old, racialized surveillance. But now it's framed as just technology. And there's another layer that people often miss. AI isn't just software, it's a whole hidden architecture of labor and resources. In the Global South, that includes underpaid data work. Kenya data labelers, for example, have been documented reviewing disturbing content to train moderation systems, low wages, serious psychological effects. So countries can be positioned as AI users on the surface, but simultaneously treated as suppliers of low-value labor underneath. And then you've got the data issue in sensitive sectors like health. AI development increasingly depends on large-scale digital records. Those data sets are incredibly valuable. And there's a paradox here that's hard to ignore. Data is encouraged to move freely across borders, while the people who generate the data face tighter borders and less mobility. So the sovereignty question isn't only where the data is stored, it's who controls it, who benefits, and what reciprocity looks like. So when people say digital sovereignty, the ground-up meaning is simple. It's the ability to run your digital life, infrastructure, data, and systems without being structurally dependent on outside corporate or geopolitical power. And the most practical way we've seen is something called digital public infrastructure, building core digital rails that are open, interoperable, and not owned by any single vendor. The design logic is what some people call hourglass model, keeping the core layer thin and open, things like identity, payments, and secure data exchange. And then lots of applications sit on top of that. The way you get innovation without locking the country into a proprietary ecosystem. And there are examples that show pieces of this. India's Stack, Brazil's Pix, and Kenya's M-Pesa. But neutrality matters here too, because sovereignty tools come with trade-offs. These systems can expand inclusion and efficiency, but they can also create risks, privacy issues, surveillance creep, executive overreach, weak standard safeguards. So sovereignty isn't just technical, it's institutional, it's legal. So if you're asking what developing nations can do in practical terms to avoid becoming digital colonies, I put it in a layered strategy. Strengthen data rights and governance so consent and value aren't exported. Build public digital rails that keep ecosystems open and reduce vendor lock-in. Invest in domestic capability, not only engineers, but regulators, procurement expertise, and auditing capacity. The bigger point is that the goal isn't digital isolation. The goal is agency. It's adopting AI in ways that protect rights, build local capacity, and keep countries on value creation side of the digital economy, not locked into a role as data suppliers, low-wage suppliers, and passive consumers.
And regional statistics shows that trade between developing nations is growing more faster than trade with the West. We see revitalized corridors between Africa, Asia, and Latin America that completely bypass the traditional Western hubs. And is this surging South-South economic integration is the ultimate buffer that will insulate these economies from the recessionary shocks hitting the US and Europe? What will be your take on this?
When looking at the statistics are fascinating. Let's anchor it with just a couple numbers. In developing economies now, about 42% of the global output and over 45% of world merchandise export. South-South trade has gone from 11% of world trade around 2000 to 26% by end of 2025. That's 6.8 trillion. And just the most recent stats put forward by UNCTAD, the rate is that it grew about 8% over the last 4 quarters, which is faster than the global average.
Rachel, sorry, your skin is freezing again. Okay,
Oh,
okay,
I
now
am
you.
so, I am so sorry that we're having
Oh,
such
okay, okay,
interruptions.
okay, no
And
worry.
the
Yeah,
funny thing is, I only normally have these screen glitches and stuff when I'm in China rather than when I'm in the US. So I think it's
okay,
funny
okay,
that's
no
happening
problem.
now.
This technical, yes, this is minor technical issues. No problem at all.
I wanted to, the statistics are really fascinating when looking at the most recent ones. When you see that UNCTAD and the fact that over the global South trade has grown
Cooperation.
8% over the last 4 quarters. That's unbelievable, faster than the global average itself. I think what matters is you can actually see the shift in physical infrastructure, new corridors that bypass old Western hubs. In Latin America, the Chance deep port in Peru is a clean example. It's basically a Pacific-facing logistics bet. Move minerals and agribusiness exports straight to China and ASEAN markets, cut reliance on North American transshipment routes, and reduce exposure to bottlenecks like the Panama Canal. The strategic wager is that flows from places like Chile, Brazil, and Peru into Asia can scale materially through the route over the next decade. In Africa, you've got the Lobito corridor, roughly 1,300 kilometers of rail logistics linking the Angolan port of Lobito into copper and cobalt zones of the DRC and Zambia. It's not just a mineral route. It's also a platform for wider regional trade and potentially more industrial linkages. And then across Eurasia, you got the middle corridor, the Trans-Caspian route that gained momentum after disruptions through Russia. And with the planned China, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan railway, you get an additional link that pulls Central Asia. So in the first part, is South-South integration rising and is it building autonomy? Yes. It creates a buffer, more routes, more partners, shorter time to market, and less dependence on few legacy choke points. But on the second part, is it the ultimate buffer against recession in the US and in Europe? I think that's where you have to be more careful. There's a long running debate here, decoupling versus recoupling. The optimists say trade more with the South, grow more independently. The cautionary viewers say even when trade looks South-South on paper, demand can still be Northern at the end of the chain. And that indirect exposure is real. A lot of South-South trade is in intermediate goods, parts, and inputs that move through hubs like Vietnam or Mexico, and then end up in final products sold to the US or the EU. So a Western consumer slump can still propagate through the chain, even if the bilateral trade line looks south-south. And there's the second constraint that keeps showing up, finance. Trade routes can diversify faster than financial structures. A lot of the global South is still peripheral to the deepest equity and bond markets. So when global financial conditions tighten, often driven by U.S. monetary shifts, it still hits hard regardless of where your trade's going. There's also the friction point inside the integration story, what some people call a second China shock dynamic. Chinese industrial surplus redirected into southern markets. That can be helpful, cheaper capital goods, investment inputs, but it can also crowd out local manufacturers where industrial bases are thinner. So integration can raise trade volumes and still produce uneven outcomes at home. To be fair, there are reasons this cycle could be more resilient than earlier ones. Recent gains have been tied to manufacturing and logistic parks in Asia and Africa. You've seen firms build new networks to hedge against Western protectionism. including that front-loading behavior when shipments accelerated ahead of U.S. Tariffs in 2025. Those adaptations can lock South-South linkages over time. So clean evidence-based conclusion, South-South integration is meaningful buffer, but it's a partial buffer, not the ultimate shield. It reduces dependence on Western hubs. It can dampen some shocks through diversification, but it doesn't fully insulate economies from Western downturns because of the indirect final demand linkages and persistent financial asymmetries. And if you want the next frontier of insulation, it's not only ports and rails, it's the monetary layer, settlement and payment infrastructure, local currency settlement, alternative payment channels, reducing exposure to dollar volatility and sanction risk. That's where the deeper resilience story really gets built.
Could you hear me, Rachel? I think I have a technical issue right now.
Oh, see, I told you we should have done this when I got back in China.
Oh, okay, now just let me ask my next questions. We are discussing these topics in the context of the security dynamics and in terms of the downward doctrines. The recent U.S. interventions to the Venezuela has sent a shockwave, at least through the hemisphere. And someone argues that it's reviving memories of 20th century interventionism. So from the perspective of the Global South, is this seen as an isolated incident of U.S. Domestic politics, or is it interpreted as a systemic signal that the rules-based order applies only when it suits to strategic interest of the great powers?
I think from the Global South perspective, it lands in two registers at the same time. On one level, people do see the domestic politics story. The operation fits a very specific U.S. political style: maximum pressure, speed over process, and domestic security frame that ties together narcotics, migration, and public health. In that reading, Venezuela becomes the stage where Washington performs resolve for a home audience, and the language of narcoterrorism and criminal jurisdiction becomes the justification for what, on the ground, looked like a decapitation strike. But here's the thing. Even if you start there, the effects don't stay domestic, and that's why the second register is the one that carries the most weight across the Global South. Because the deeper interpretation, especially in places like Brasilia, Pretoria, New Delhi, and Jakarta, is that this is a systemic signal about the conditional nature of sovereignty under the so-called rules-based order. The shock isn't only that force was used, it's how it was used and how it was narrated. A sitting head of state removed under judicial extraction logic, effectively sidestepping the UN Security Council and framing regime change as law enforcement. And the method matters. What people watched was not a symbolic gesture. It was a multi-domain operation on capital. Air power, electronic warfare, special operations, and the reports about electronic overmatch. The idea that defensive systems could be neutralized so completely that nothing worked, that hits smaller states like a psychological earthquake. It suggests a world where territorial defense can be made irrelevant, not only by firepower, but by invisible technological dominance. Then there's the legal layer, which is where a lot of the Global South interpretation hardens, because the way this was justified fuels an older critique that international law is becoming less a shared restraint and more a language powerful states use when it's convenient. When domestic doctrines and criminal indictments are used to retrofit legitimacy onto actions that look, to many legal observers, like a direct collision with the UN Charter's prohibition on the unilateral use of force. It reinforces the sense that rules are not universal. That's also where the Donroe Doctrine framing comes in, because it signals a return to spheres of influence logic. The implicit message is that sovereignty becomes conditional inside a strategic domain if a government is labeled as hosting hostile external actors or transnational criminal networks or both. Now, staying neutral, it's also true that some governments quietly concede the underlying Venezuelan crisis is real. Mass displacement, the humanitarian breakdown, the cross-border spillovers, those aren't imaginary. That reality is what you don't see one uniform. That's why you don't see one uniform ideological response. States aren't comfortable with unilateral force, still have to deal with practicalities, migration, organized crime, energy markets, etc. And that's why the reaction's fragmented. It's the fragmentation itself is a signal. In Latin America, you see rejection and alignment side by side, and the inability to consolidate a single regional position. You have major states condemning the intervention as an affront to sovereignty, warning about the law of the strongest. You also have governments that welcomed Maduro's removal and aligned with Washington's stability through force narrative. And the Caribbean response is telling because it's less ideological and more immediate. Panic about airspace disruption, flight cancellation, and spillover risk. In other words, small states feel the cost first, even when they didn't choose the strategic environment. Outside the hemisphere, the tone shifts from politics to precedent anxiety. The African Union emphasized non-intervention and dialogue. South Africa's line was sharply legalistic, unlawful unilateral force determines the order itself. And in parts of Asia, you see a different kind of discomfort. For states that rely on the idea of rules as protection against larger neighbors, the Venezuelan operation weakens the moral and strategic claim that status quo can't be changed by force. If major powers can do it in Carcass, critics ask, what stops others from using parallel logic elsewhere? India was the cleanest illustration of pragmatism under constraint. Public language of concern and dialogue, but calibrated vocabulary, not just the strongest common denomination, because strategic trade-offs are real and states calculate costs in real time. And then there's the geoeconomic layer that amplifies the systemic reading, oil. Venezuelan reserves are enormous. And when the intervention is followed by the rhetoric of running the country, rebuilding oil infrastructure, lifting sanctions, and being reimbursed, it inevitably feeds the perception, fairly or unfairly, that resources and coercion are fused. That doesn't prove a single motive, but perception matters because it echoes a historical pattern the region remembers. Intervention justified in moral or security language, followed by economic reordering. So is this an isolated incident of U.S. domestic politics or a systemic signal that the rules only apply when it's convenient? The answer is it's convenient and it's trigger, very tied to U.S. domestic politics and particular strategic style. But it's systemic in its consequences because it sets precedent other countries can point to, mimic, or exploit. And for the Global South, the takeaway isn't just outrage, it's adaptation. More hedging, more demand for strategic autonomy, more urgency behind alternative diplomatic and financial architectures. Because in a world like this, rules protect you most when someone else is willing to respect them.
And just for decades, for years, the demand has been to reform the UN Security Council to give a permanent seat to the countries of the Global South, India, Africa, or Latin America. So given the persistent deadlock, are we reaching to a tipping point where the Global South invests its political capital into strengthening parallel institutions like expanded the BRICS or the Shanghai Cooperation Organizations, or effectively leaving all the institutions to become irrelevant discussion clubs?
I don't think we're at a clean replace the UN moment yet, but we are definitely in a phase of institutional displacement, meaning a growing number of the Global South states are acting as if the old system may not be fixable fast enough, and they're building parallel options. So they're not trapped waiting for a reform process that never lands. Because the legitimacy problem starts with a basic mismatch. The Security Council is still essentially a 1945 snapshot. even though UN membership has expanded dramatically and the world's population has gone from roughly 2.5 billion then into over 8 billion now. So for decades, the reform demand, permanent representation for India, for Africa, for Latin America, has been one of the most consistent Global South positions in modern diplomacy. But what's changed is the sense that the reform pathway has become a cul-de-sac. And it's not only political, it's procedural. Intergovernmental negotiations have struggled to move from broad statements into text-based negotiations, line-by-line bargaining, the kind of process that actually produces outcomes. So the deep debate keeps looping, but it doesn't convert into a draft that forces real trade-offs. And the paralysis is happening at the same time the Council's performance has visibly deteriorated. So the frustration is not abstract, it's lived. You can see it in veto power. We've had a spike in veto usage and strategic blocking. And you can see it in output. Resolution counts dropping to historically low levels, signals that consensus capacity is thinning. And the most visible evidence of that paralysis has been the Council's inability to respond quickly and credibly to big crises like Gaza and Ukraine, where the Council starts to look a lot like a stage for great power shielding rather than a mechanism for timely restraint. Now, to be fair, it's not just because the Council's old, it's because reform threatens real power. The veto isn't symbolic, it's instrumental. And no permanent member wants to dilute privilege that defines their strategic leverage, not even China. And then you have the second layer of deadlock, regional rivalry. Even within the Global South, there isn't one unified reform blueprint, and those differences matter. You have the G4, India, Brazil, Germany, Japan, pushing for new permanent seats and additional non-permanent seats. You have the Uniting for Consensus group pushing back, countries that oppose any expansion of the permanent category because they fear it creates new privileged actors. And Africa has its own hard line. More specifically, if Africa gets permanent seats, they must come with full rights of permanence, including the veto, because anything less reproduces the original injustice of 1945. And that's how you get the veto stalemate. That's almost mechanical. The P5 won't extend veto privileges, and Africa won't accept permanent status without equal rights. Meanwhile, in Asia and Latin America, regional competitors can quietly block each other's ambition. So reform becomes everyone's stated objective, no one's reachable agreement. Against that, pivot makes strategic sense. It's not always a dramatic break. It's often a reallocation of political capital. Plain terms, instead of spending decades of trying to renovate the house, more states building additional rooms next door. That's where the expanded BRICS and the SCO come in. The big idea here is complex multilateralization. Multiple overlapping platforms that give non-Western powers more agency in trade, finance, and security without having to wait for Western gatekeepers. BRICS Plus is an excellent example. What started as an acronym has turned into a political project. The expansion, bringing in Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Indonesia, it signals demand for a governance space that feels more representative and more responsive. And it's not only symbolism, there's material weight behind it. Measured by purchasing parity, BRICS now exceeds the G7 share of global GDP. That shifts in economic gravity give BRICS a platform to push priorities around development, finance, and institutional reform, whether the old system moves or not. Then you get the financial front where the parallel architecture story becomes more concrete. The new development bank matters here because it's designed around substantive equality and demand-driven model that emphasizes sovereignty and technical criteria. And it's explicitly linked to an agenda of increasing local currency lending, not because the dollar disappears, because so many developing economies live under what economists call currency hierarchy. They're structurally exposed to dollar liquidity shocks, and Western monetary policy transmits quickly into inflation, debt costs, and fiscal spaces. So the NDP is part of a larger effort to build policy space. On the security side, The SCO plays a different role. It began as a regional security formation, but has broadened into counterterrorism, narcotics trafficking, and information security. And now even discussions around AI cooperation frameworks and proposals for new development bank capacity. As for many states, the SCO's appeal isn't operational and regional specific. Its regional anti-terrorism structure, RATS, is often cited, but it's not just declaratory. It's designed to coordinate practical counterterrorism security work. So I think, we're reaching a tipping point where the Global South is pouring its political capital into parallel platforms and leaving the old institutions as discussion clubs. I'd frame it, I think we're approaching a tipping point in function, not necessarily in symbolism. The UN still matters, especially as a universal forum. But the Council's hard power, role over security outcomes, is hollowed out when it's repeatedly can act in major crises. And when that happens, legitimacy drains because effectiveness is a part of legitimacy. At the same time, I wouldn't oversell replacement. Global South states aren't abandoning it; they're hedging it, and I think that's the real story here.
And Rachel, okay, just complete your words. I try to ask my other questions.
It's okay. Just at the end of the day, I think the beauty of all of this is that we're moving towards a multi-centric order.
And if we project 5 years into the future, the optimistic view is a multiplex world where diversity, at least we see, that leads to this stability. The pessimistic view is a chaotic fragmentation of the regions. So if the Global South effectively harnesses its demographic dividend and resources, wealth, what is the single most important change we will see in the daily life of the average citizen in the Global South by 2030 or later?
I love this question. I think the biggest change in daily life we feel won't be geopolitical, but practical. I think it'll be the moment an ordinary person stops living as a shock absorber and starts living with more everyday control. So I think a lot more people will have the basic infrastructure of agency. And I mean a simple stack: connectivity, usable digital ID, and cheap instant payments, increasingly supported by reliable, decentralized power. And when that first stack exists, a normal day changes. First, opportunity stops being so dependent on geography. You don't have to relocate to a capital city just to get access. With broader connectivity, mobile, broadband, satellite coverage, cheaper data, more people can learn, earn, sell, and collaborate from where they live. Second, small businesses stop living at the mercy of payment friction. A lot of entrepreneurs in the Global South don't fail because they lack ideas. They fail because they're constantly fighting currency scarcity, conversion spreads, and delays. As regional payment rails and local currency settlement expand, trade gets cheaper and more predictable, and that shows up fast. Prices stabilize, costs come down, and planning replaces improvisation. Third, households stop organizing life around electricity cuts. Decentralized renewables and pay-as-you-go solar don't just add convenience, they change capability. Refrigeration for medicine, students studying at night, devices staying charged, solar irrigation that replaces diesel, and micro enterprises that can finally run consistently instead on short bursts. And the keystone here under all of this is digital legal identity. Once people can prove who they are cleanly and easily, they can open accounts, access credit cards, receive benefits, register a business, and build a track record. In a lot of places, that's a line between stuck in informality and stepping into the formal economy. So in the optimistic multiplex world, the change is quietly radical. More people become economic actors with options, not just citizens waiting for external shock to rearrange their lives. But to keep my on a pessimistic track a little bit here, because the same tools can flip. If fragmentation wins, if standards splinter, interoperability breaks, cyber risks rise, and governments use technology to tighten control, then connectivity doesn't automatically become freedom. It can mean surveillance, disinformation, and widening inequality, where some places leap forward and others stall. And the demographic dividend only becomes a dividend if skills keep pace. Otherwise, it becomes pressure. So I'll land it here. If the Global South harnesses its demographic and resource advantages well, the single biggest daily change is a jump in everyday economic agency, the ability to connect, prove identity, transact, and power daily life through decentralized system. And whether that produces stability or fragmentation comes down to governance, skills, interoperability, and cyber resilience, and whether these tools are built to expand opportunity rather than police it.
Rachel, thank you very much for this fascinating and rich experience and details you shared with me, with my audiences. I think I more understand the Global South now.
I'm so sorry for it. Thank you for having me. I'm really sorry for the technical difficulties.
Okay, there is no issues because I also have some technical issues sometimes during my show. This is technical, beyond our capability. We cannot do anything. And thank you very much again for joining me and sharing your experience about the Global South.
Thank you very much. Maybe next time we'll do it when I'm in China.
Yes, why not? Okay, also for my friends, for my subscribers, thank you very much for joining us, for listening our conversation until the end. Please share the link of the conversation with your friends, with your networks who are wondering and want to know more about the Global South. And please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell, and see you on the next live streams.
Take care.